The world will mark the 80th anniversary of the end of World War II later this year. Today's guest helps us understand the murderous leaders of Nazi Germany and the people at every level of German society who did their bidding. He's Richard J. Evans this week on Story in the Public Square. Hello and welcome to Story in the Public Square, where storytelling meets public affairs. I'm Jim Ludis from the Pell Center at Salve Regina University.
And I'm G. Wayne Miller, also with Salve's Pell Center.
And our guest this week is Sir Richard J. Evans, the preeminent historian of the Third Reich today. His most recent book is Hitler's People, The Faces of the Third Reich, a powerfully written and timely history. He joins us today from the United Kingdom. Richard, thank you so much for being with us.
Hi, thanks very much for inviting me on.
So 2025 is the 80th anniversary of the end of the Second World War. I wonder what you think the legacy of the war is today.
Well, the war, of course, reshaped Europe's boundaries. It had a hugely powerful effect on the continent and more globally worldwide. If you look across at Japan and China, and then, of course, at you over the other side of the Atlantic from me. And it's also become remembered as the most destructive war in history. Perhaps 50 million people were killed, and those included, of course, the 6 million Jews who were deliberately exterminated in the Holocaust. So it's a very powerful and long-lasting legacy.
I mentioned that you are the preeminent historian of the Third Reich today. Your trilogy on the Third Reich is a must-read for any student of history. I'm curious, what drew you to study Nazi Germany in the first place?
Well, I grew up on the eastern fringes of London, so the East End, and my parents used to take me in to the East End to do shopping or to go to church or whatever it was. And I saw in the 50s, because I'm a baby boomer, of course, as you can guess, I saw the long lines of terraced houses interrupted sometimes by bomb sites. The rubble had all been cleared away. But rather shockingly, I remember seeing this kind of strange intimacy of the bedroom wallpaper on the undamaged houses on either side of the bomb site. So, of course, I asked myself, who did this and why? And so I started to think about Nazi Germany, what had driven it. And then when I got to Oxford as the university student there, in the mid-60s, the Germans had just woken up from kind of 20 years of amnesia following the war, and we're starting to write and think and argue seriously about the Holocaust, and then even more about the war and the rise of the Nazis. And so it was a very, very exciting time of discovery to get into German history, and I decided to do a doctorate on the longer term origins of the Third Reich. So that's really what got me into. I don't have any personal connection at all with Germany. In fact, I recently had a DNA test, and it turns out I am 100% North Welsh. So my parents left separately a tiny corner of North Wales, Welsh-speaking Wales. They learned English at school for London because there weren't any jobs in North Wales, and they met and married there, and I'm the result of that. So, but it's definitely, that's why I don't speak with a Cockney accent.
So let's turn to your book, Hitler's People, The Faces of the Third Reich. Can you give us your own high-level overview of the book? And it's a tremendous, incredibly well-researched book.
Well, thank you very much, Wayne. I wrote this 3-volume history of Nazi Germany, starting in 2003, and the third volume came out in 2008, and I've been teaching the subject, a detailed subject, document-based course from 1982 onwards. And so I had a lot of stuff prepared, a lot of documents collected, and I'd been reading very broadly on it for many years. But after I published that 3-volume history, I just thought I'd turn to other things. So I wrote a history of 19th century Europe, for example, and a couple of books on the kind of historiography, the theory and practice of history. But I got interested in looking at biographies as a way into the history of Nazi Germany. I mean, I did talk about people in my 3 volumes, but no focus on individuals. And that had been out of fashion for a long time because particularly German historians fought shy of looking at doing biographical studies, because of the Nazis themselves, of course, had this great man theory of history, and they thought, well, the greatest man of all, is the culmination, namely Hitler. So they'd fought shy of it. It was much more kind of impersonal forces, the broad sweep of history and so on, structures, social science methods and approaches. But around the turn of the century, about a quarter of a century ago, 25 years ago, that began to change, and it became more acceptable to write biographies. And my friend Ian Kershaw's wonderful 2-volume biography of Hitler, for example, was led the way, really. And a lot of biographies have come out since then. And also, of course, new documents with the fall of communism, the fall of the Berlin Wall. Archives opened up in Eastern Europe, and fantastic collections of Nazi materials began to appear. So take just one example, is the Nazi propaganda minister, Joseph Goebbels. His complete diaries on microfiche were discovered in a Moscow archive. And the last of 32 volumes came out in 2008. So there's a lot of relatively recent material. So I thought, well, this is the opportunity, and I was led to it by doing two TV series, one for BBC Two called Rise of the Nazis, and another one for Netflix called Hitler on Trial. It was called Hitler and the Nazis, Evil on Trial. That's right. And they both took a rather person-focused approach and led me back to the idea of biography. And I thought, well, let me try and then approach the subject through the biographical angle. So I have a section on a long introductory chapter on Hitler, based on a reading of his speeches and writings and Goebbels' diaries and so on. And then I have a section with several chapters on the top Nazis, Goering, Goebbels, Himmler, and so on. And then a third section on the kind of middle-ranking ones, Heydrich, Eichmann, etc. And then final one on the fourth level on minor Nazis, which you might call ordinary mass murderers, fellow travelers, henchmen, that kind of thing. So it's structured around these 4 sections. And of course, people keep asking me, why didn't you put that person in? Why did you have a chapter on this? And my answer is always, well, it's 600 pages long. I mean, how much do you want?
So that leads me to a question. Once you move beyond Hitler and his lieutenants and the party down to individuals, how did you decide who to include? I mean, you obviously had thousands of possibilities. Talk about that, please. Thank you.
Well, it's dependent a lot on what material is available, and particularly on relatively recently discovered material. So, for example, the war crimes trials tended to produce a lot of material, so I went for them. I tended to avoid, if I could, really famous people, though I do have a chapter on Leni Riefenstahl, the film director, partly because she always claimed not to have been a Nazi, and there's some relatively recent work which shows that actually she wasn't really telling the truth. So I chose I have a chapter on the army, right? So, but I didn't want to get one of the really famous generals like Rommel or Guderian or Manstein. I chose a rather obscure general called Wilhelm Ritter von Leeb, and I have a chapter on him because he kept a diary, and also because he's a very good example of how the army was corrupted by the Nazis. He wasn't himself a Nazi, but he was kept quiet, and his doubts about the Holocaust in particular kept quiet by the gift of a large estate, a landed estate in southern Bavaria by Hitler, bribed in effect. So there are a number of ways in which he was kept quiet.
So Richard, I've written a number of nonfiction books, and in doing the research, particularly for people I had never heard of, I almost felt like I got to know these people through the research. Was that your experience too,
Yes,
in
well, what I
recreating?
found,
Yeah.
yeah, I found a lot of the Nazis, beginning, of course, with Hitler, had been demonized. They'd been portrayed, for example, as uh, criminals, as crooks from the very beginning, out to kind of milk Germany for whatever they can get. There's a fantastic movie made by John Farrow, the father of Mia Farrow, I suppose he's best known as nowadays, starring not the inevitable John Wayne, but also, but in fact, unknown actors who were chosen for the way they physically resembled leading Nazis, and was done to explain to GIs who they were fighting against in 1941 when they started going across to Europe. And it's called the Hitler Gang, and it's done in the style of a 1930s Hollywood gangster movie. You know those great ones with Edward G. Robbins and Humphrey Bogart and Jimmy Cagney and so on. So it's very entertaining, but it's not. It's not the convincing approach at all. These people came, I found, from the middle of German society, from the middle classes and the respectable bourgeois, if you like to use that word. And so I felt I did get to know quite a few of them in the round, as it were, rather than as the simple two-dimensional demonic figures they'd previously been portrayed as. And they were not psychopaths. Again, that's another way they've been approached as people who are mentally disturbed. But that, of course, lets all of us off the hook. We don't have to think that we have to think about ourselves and what potential we might have for something like that. So these are people from the middle classes. There's no workers among them, no ex-socialists, no ex-communists. They come from a nationalist, ultra-nationalist, conservative middle-class background.
You know, you as a student of history myself, I can remember sitting in university classes, doing lectures, and thinking about the Third Reich. And the question I always asked myself is, if I had been a young man in Germany in 1937, 1938, 1939, how would I have reacted? Would I have been repulsed by the regime, or would I have aspired to be a good participant of the party? And that question terrifies me. And I don't know that enough people grapple with that kind of question.
Yeah, well, of course, the answer is inevitably historical. It depends what part of society you are in.
Yeah.
And we have some memoirs of people who were young at the time. And for example, if you were an active Catholic, then you probably would not have been a Nazi. You had to join the Hitler Youth by law, but that didn't mean you subscribed to everything that you were told by the Hitler Youth. Whereas if you were working class, again, if your parents were working class and ex-communists or ex-socialists, then you might have rebelled against them. And what better way to rebelling against them than joining the Nazi party? So it's a very varied picture. On the whole, younger people tended to be more Nazi than older people, because the whole system of education, the media, the Hitler Youth, all of those institutions were banging into young people the doctrines of Nazism, including anti-Semitism.
Well, so let's talk a little bit about Hitler himself. You draw a parallel between Hitler, the failed artist with dreams of artistic success, and Hitler, the dictator at the end of the Third Reich, in his bunker in Berlin, moving imaginary armies around maps of Berlin. It's one thing to delude yourself. It's another thing to delude a once great nation. Why was Hitler able to succeed?
Well, he didn't succeed to begin with. So he was born in 1889. He was a kind of a drifter living for a time in men's hostels for the homeless until he found himself in World War I, joined the army, and gave his life a kind of structure and meaning. So at the end of the war, when Germany was defeated, of course, he was totally shocked. It was a real trauma for him. And that meant that he went into ultra right-wing politics, but didn't have any success until the Wall Street crash, as it were, pulled the rug from under the German economy. And the Nazi party he led started to grow until it was the largest party very quickly in 1932. So in 1928, the Nazis got less than 3% of the vote. So they were a very new party. And people who voted for them, they never made up much more than 1/3 of the German electorate, 37.4%. Now, we must remember that. It's not the case that all Germans kind of suddenly flocked to Hitler's banner. But this is a time when there's no TV, there's a weekly newsreel you might get your reports from. Not many radios. German radio ownership was really quite low. It's public speaking to vast crowds, carefully calculated razzmatazz, banners, music, chants, and all the rest of it. And Hitler had the ability to move crowds. He'd always start speaking very softly with long pauses, so you had to kind of strain to hear him, and then he'd build up to a climax in which he would move the crowds who had come to attend him. And so he was made head of a German government, but a coalition government in which conservative nationalists were in the majority. They wanted a mass movement, the Nazis, to give their policies of overturning democracy, the so-called Weimar Republic, they want to give them legitimacy. So that is how he got into power. He outmaneuvered them. He had mass violence on the streets against the enemies of the Nazis, the socialists and communists, open up concentration camps for them. And the first concentration camps were not for the Jews. Remember, they're less than 1% of the German population, though they were blamed by the Nazis in a kind of bizarre conspiracy theory for stabbing the German army in the back through subversion in World War I. There's not a shred of plausibility about it, but that's what Hitler and his friends, his colleagues, found a convincing way of explaining Germany's defeat in World War I. So it's a situation in which he achieves supreme power by the summer of 1933 and creates a dictatorship.
So that's one of the broad themes that emerges in your book. We wanted to get into a couple of the others, if you don't mind.
Sure.
The Nazi Party was overtly militarist in outlook. What explains that? Where did that come from?
Well, we're looking here at the aftermath of World War I, and this is a very militarized society. This has been the biggest human conflict in world history. And if you look at newsreels and so on of the 1920s, you can see how many men are in uniform. Every political party in Germany in the 20s had its own paramilitary uniformed branch, which was fighting the uniformed branches of other parties. So, the Nazis have the stormtroopers, the conservative nationalists have the steel helmets, the communists have the Red Front Fighters League, the socialists have the Reich banner, and so on. And this is a very violent, militarized society already, in which democracy is quite, it's not a stable democracy. It gets somewhere towards establishing itself in the prosperous years of the mid-20s. But even so, in 1932, over 400 people were killed in the election campaign of the summer of 32. It's an incredible number.
It is an incredible number. One of the, I think the just obvious patterns that emerges to me is the effectiveness of the dehumanization of the victims of Nazi crimes. Again and again, the way you tell each of these biographies through either the denouement in a war crimes trial or the end of the subjects' lives leads us to a discussion and a consideration of their role in Nazi atrocities. But one of the things that emerges again and again and again is the perception that they hadn't done anything wrong, and part of that seems to be built on this belief that their victims were less than human. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, I think that's very perceptive because once you start regarding people as less than fully human, you open the road to genocide and mass murder. And I have a chapter on Karl Brandt, who was a skillful surgeon. He learned his trade in the mining area of the Ruhr in Western Germany. And he was married. He was a very sort of tall, good-looking young man. He married a swimming champion, a young lady of the sort who Hitler rather fancied, I think. And so he was in a motorcade with Hitler and some others. And one of the cars, not Hitler's car, but one of the cars crashed and badly injured the Nazi who was in it. And Brandt rushed over and kind of dealt with him, got him into hospital. He had to surgically remove an eye, which was damaged in the crash, mend his bones and so on. And Hitler thought, well, this is a bit of a lesson. I've got to have a personal doctor who's with me all the time in case something like that, a crash happens or an accident. And from there, Brandt then moved eventually with Hitler's appointments to becoming the head of an action, so-called Action T4, named after Hitler's Berlin party headquarters, to kill by gassing, starvation, or lethal injection up to 200,000 mentally ill and mentally handicapped Germans, not Jews, but Germans. And that was the idea there was Brandt was thought, well, we've got to, this is to improve the human race. You've got to eliminate negative people, stop them from reproducing, stop them having any kind of influence on German society. And this, of course, was a violation of every moral precept that normal human societies run by, every ethical principle of medicine. Think of the Hippocratic Oath that doctors are supposed to swear to do the sick no harm. And so Brandt was put on trial by the American military court after the war in one of the follow-up Nuremberg trials after they tried the main Nazis, the doctor's trial. And he couldn't see he'd done anything wrong at all. I was only trying to improve the human race, he said, before he was executed for his crimes of mass murder.
Stunning. Richard, you one of the biographies included in the book is a look at the life of Joseph Goebbels. And at the end of that chapter, you note that some of the techniques that Goebbels pioneered are still alive and with us in Western politics today, whether it's Viktor Orban in Hungary or Donald Trump here in the United States. I'm curious what you've seen that perhaps others have missed.
Well, of course, we live in an age of misinformation and disinformation, which I think is not really true of previous historians who've written about the leading Nazis. And that, I think, gives us a kind of new insights and new ways of looking at this. And you can see therefore some parallels between Goebbels' techniques and those of present day demagogues, rabble-rousers, and would-be or actual dictators. So, for example, attaching derogatory labels to your opponents. So Goebbels tended to do that. He was always in trouble with the head of the police in Berlin, where he was based, Bernhard Weiss. And so he attached a label to him, Isidor, he would call him, because he was Jewish. It wasn't his name at all. You could find Goebbels' phrases again and again attempt to undermine the legitimacy of his opponents. And that's a technique that's also used today. I also found, for example, that there is a parallel between Hitler's speeches in particularly the war between 39 and 45, which are full of hyperbole. They're full of massive exaggerations, of narcissistic rhetoric. This battle is the greatest battle in world history. This victory is the greatest victory there's ever been won. I am the greatest war leader, the greatest general of all time. And you can find that in Donald Trump's rhetoric as well. There is this, I'm the fittest president there's ever been. The crowds attending my inauguration were the greatest there have ever been, and so on. I think there are huge differences between Hitler and Trump. I mean, the most essential one, of course, is Hitler was a militarist who wanted to conquer other countries and did for a time, whereas Donald Trump, of course, is not. He's the reverse. He's an isolationist. He wants to pull American troops out of the rest of the world, and that's a fundamental difference.
Richard, we could talk to you all day. We've got just about a minute left. I'm wondering, are there lessons from the history of the Third Reich that you think are particularly important in 2025?
Well, lessons important, you mean. So I think, first of all, as we've already said, once you start declassifying, dehumanizing a category of people, then that's the road to mass murder. And I think you have to resist that. You have to resist racism wherever it appears and not allow it to flourish and fester and destroy society from within. And also, if you are a conventional political person, if you belong to mainstream politics, do not go along and collaborate with ultra extremists of the right or indeed the left. You have to keep them out of mainstream politics. And finally, the truth. As a historian, of course, I believe, I've devoted my life to finding out the truth about the past and understanding it. And I think we have to value the truth more than it's currently valued in social media.
Richard Evans, this has been a privilege and an important conversation. Thank you so much for spending some time with us. The book is Hitler's People. It's an exceptional read. That's all the time we have this week, but if you want to know more about Story in the Public Square, you can find us on social media or visit pellcenter.org, where you can always catch up on previous episodes. He's Wayne, I'm Jim, asking you to join us again next time for more Story in the Public Square.